great. Thank you. Thank you, David, for that really excellent talk. Really reminded me of my colleague who says all the time, I don't know why the church is obsessed with sex. Jesus talked way more about money than he did about sex. Um, so thinking about money and Christian activism, I just wanted to start with a statistic that last year, more than 200,000 children were referred to the National Health System in the UK for anxiety. The different system, I mean service, obviously. Young people are crippled by anxiety, depression, climate anxiety, and stress. The precarity of life is making selfishness not only normal, but presumed to be necessary. Um, and I think this is also something that is happening in the church. So I think young people are really feeling anxious and irritated about a cognitive dissonance that we have in churches. So the church can proclaim and say one thing, but in action and doing, it's very much doing a different thing. So in 2021, I edited my first collection called Young, Woke and Christian. This was talking about how younger people in UK churches feel like they're not really being valued or listened to. And I was playing with the term the missing generation and kind of saying, well, if you keep calling them missing and they're not going to come back, they're there, you're just not paying attention. And we had chapters on kind of like interfaith homelessness, disability theology, and there was also one on kind of food security, peacemaking, etc. And a couple of years ago, I did Awake, Emerging and Connected, and the idea of this one was to push the UK church to think about things a little bit more. So it's much more philosophical, theological, and it's focused on what justice looks like in this current world where it seems like we have no control over anything. And two of the chapters in there specifically, I think, are quite helpful for this conversation. The first one is from William Gibson, who is a current, they don't call it ordinands in the Church of Scotland, but I've forgotten what they call it now. He's training for ministry in the Church of Scotland, and he kind of wrote about the history of trade unions and how Christianity works so closely with trade unions. And Ian Rowe as well, who works at the moment in a homeless charity in London, but previously was a historian, and his chapter, Step Forward or Backwards, he was talking with a formerly homeless person thinking about progress in British society and questioning kind of, well, we think we're progressing, but we are in some respects, but in other respects there are more people who are homeless, there are more people who are economically insecure, there's a widening gap between the rich and the poor, so how on earth can we say that we're progressing in any way whatsoever when more and more people's basic needs aren't being met? And just kind of on this idea of young people, I recently was a delegate at the Faith and Order conference in Egypt. I was by far the youngest person, one of the only women, and there weren't very many kind of like normal people. Many people had very big hats. It was quite intimidating. But my favourite thing that was said in the whole conference was a message from the youth kind of theological forum. And so they called on the church to live its prophetic duty to speak truth to power in all its forms, standing in solidarity with the poor and oppressed, following in the incarnational way of Christ who entered into human reality, the Word made flesh, dwelling in solidarity with the downtrodden. We need fearless unity, and our shared ecumenical theology cannot be only abstract in nature, rather it is our imperative to kenotically embody Christ and empty ourselves for the other. And this, read alongside the Faith and Order conference statement, if anyone has been brave enough to trawl through it, was pretty dramatic, actually. It was amazing. There really was chalk and cheese just saying such different things. It was a real challenge. So when I think about kind of the question of like, why are younger people like so angry? Why do they want to protest so much? Kind of my response is like, this isn't new. Like if we're looking at the history of the student Christian movement, YMCA, etc., young people were at the forefront of this kind of thing, and this is normal. The frustration is coming from churches not being prophetic, churches not speaking out about kind of poverty, about the capitalist system, necropolitics, etc., etc. So in a recent book by Chris Shanahan, which has just been published by SEM Press, this Life on the Breadline project did like some in-depth case studies of some kind of like parachurch charities that were looking to end poverty. But he also talked to church leaders and practitioners. And in talking to the church leaders, some of the responses, Chris talked about how most of the kind of Christian church responses are like charity. It's about caring. It's about like a doing mission, maybe like a food bank or a homeless shelter, etc. And kind of there's a shy away from like an advocacy protest kind of sense. Um, so, an Anglican mission enabler from the west of England, for instance, said that it's easier to respond practically and to stay out of campaigning and advocacy, suggesting that getting political is always controversial. It's so intertwined with party politics, and people are really anxious about mixing party politics and faith. A Pentecostal leader from the southeast of England said the church should only deal with the symptoms of poverty because the real cause of poverty falls outside of our realm of influence and needs governmental involvement. And a Salvation Army leader from the west of Scotland made a similar point that I think we are better placed to tackle the consequences of poverty than the root causes. You'll see as I go through my presentation that I completely disagree with those views. And I mean, a really important example of where the church hasn't had an arm's length is the Faith and City report from the Church of England, which created the Church Urban Fund, which is still flourishing. There has been a recent book that I co-edited with Chris Baker from the William Temple Foundation called Faith in the City 40 Years On, and we re-look at the Faith in the City report and kind of we think about its legacy for today. Like if this report was going to be redone, what would be different? But ultimately, we want to hold it up as this is still a prophetic piece of theology. The suggestions that came from this report that were challenging government, speaking truth to power, they were still quite ahead of their time. We had some problems with the methodology, and we're wondering who was missed out. I mean, there was only one working class voice that was quoted in the whole report. But in general, it's the confidence, and it's also the confidence of the Temple movement, also the Anglican social justice theology that was prevalent. And I also kind of want to hold up the voices of people who are in poverty to counter the church leaders who think they have no responsibility. How can we say that it's not our job to deal with the root causes of poverty when people are saying, I'm doing everything that they're telling me to do, but I'm still choosing whether I heat my home or I feed my kids? And this quote was given to the Let's End Poverty campaign, which Church Action on Poverty was one of the pioneers of. So in this presentation, I'm going to give 3 examples of the ways that the church has been super involved in thinking about activism and poverty. There's a myriad of examples I could have chosen, but I've chosen 3 because they're kind of in different areas. So the first one, I'm thinking about like a personal responsibility to thinking about how we use our money. I also then want to think about money, how money binds us as Christians in a kind of communion, and how we should respond to that. And then finally, I want to think about how we deal with money with the theology that it's not ours. Money is God's. So how should that change the way that we relate to it? So my first example, this is a recent article that I wrote in Modern Believing, Accountability and Economic Witness in the Iona Community. So I'm a member of the Iona community. My PhD thesis looked at the Iona community and also the Council for Mission, which was the London Missionary Society. In my PhD thesis, I wanted to kind of write the history of the Iona community as they were in the beginning, which was a missional community. So the mission of the Iona community, as it was set up in 1938 by George MacLeod, was to reach the working classes of Scotland, which feels quite different from where the Iona community is today, if you know very much about the lovely songs and the statements, etc. But the whole point of the community wasn't to rebuild an abbey on Iona, it wasn't to revitalise worship, it wasn't to bring back Celtic Christianity. All of these were just little tools in MacLeod's pockets for his real mission, which was to reach the new housing estates that were built from the slum clearances in post-World War II Scotland. That was it, very, very simple mission. And the way that he thought to do that was to rebuild an abbey on Iona and have kind of builders, like working class builders, alongside ministers in training for the Church of Scotland, that they'd live together and rebuild the abbey together and worship together and understand each other. And then his theory went that the ministers, having made connections with working class people and understanding their culture, they'd then be better able to serve the working class communities that needed, so probationer, that's what they're called, that needed probationers to go and serve them. So as this kind of community worked together, as the craftsmen and the ministers of the Church of Scotland started to know each other, they came up with a rule. In the beginning, it was just three things. It was daily prayer, it was common, thinking about the use of time, and thinking about the use of resources. And the use of time is really, really interesting. So as ministers are working alongside the builders, they kind of realised, like, builders have to clock in, they clock out, taking breaks, and doing ministry is quite different from that. So they needed to prove to each other that they were both committed to the project. So the kind of the rule is expanded a little bit from there. So it's got the daily prayer and Bible reading that we do each morning. We have the sharing and accounting for the uses of our resources, including money. That bit's quite important. I'll come back to that. Planning and accounting for the use of our time. Action for justice and peace in society and the integrity of creation. And meeting with and accounting to one another. And so the rule displaces individualism by upholding action for justice and peace and the integrity of creation, and enabling a particular kind of solidarity and a release from the pressure of capitalism's limited individualistic idea of anthropocentric net worth. Why do I say that? Okay, I say that, I just kind of banged that in there, didn't I? That's quite heavy. The idea of like the kind of like accounting for our time and accounting for our resources. When we do this in community, what we mean is this takes away the individual pressure of us. We aren't just ourselves having to kind of fight through this war, but kind of we're there to support each other. So in community, when we share how we're using our money, it's not a judgment thing. It's kind of an accountability thing. It's a trust thing. And with the fourth rule for the action for justice and peace in society, we see our resources and our responsibility to work towards that. So it's all connected. So the late Kathy Galloway, she explained in her little book about the rule that it is kept. The reason that it's kept is much less to do with any kind of personal holiness or personal responsibility towards one's wealth, and more to do with a letting go of this individualized duty. And Galloway reflects on her public addresses about the community. She noticed that we have overcome the taboos in her time about talking about sex or talking about politics and religion in our public discourse, but money, our own, is still considered to be very private. And she found that kind of whenever she was out and about in the community, the thing that people had the most problem with was the economic rule. That was the most controversial thing. But of course, capitalism thrives off that. Capitalism thrives off of our secrets and our lies. And the current economic order promotes the market as the primary engine of human economic activity, emphasizing competition and growth and upholding individual self-interest over the common good. Which is a counter to that. Our own flourishing isn't private, but we only flourish when we all flourish, is kind of the theology behind it. The article that I wrote was kind of in response to an article that was written by two accountants in universities, one in Melbourne and one in Cardiff, who analysed the accounting method of the Iona community in a journal that was like Audit, Accountability and something else, like a very specialist journal. They did a pretty good job, and I found it fascinating. But they were quite nervous that it was quite a dominating model, that they thought it was like a way of could lead into a way of control and coercion, etc. Whereas my argument was actually the coercion and the control that the whole economic model is trying to undo. The current economic order is a form of domination. It's an ideology that claims to not have any alternative, demands an endless flow of sacrifices from the poor and from the whole creation, claiming sovereignty over life and demanding total allegiance, and this amounts to idolatry. This amounts to mammon. So this is from the World Communion Reformed Church's Accra Confession in 2004. And if anyone's not familiar with that, I would really encourage you to read it, because it's quite powerful. So accountability in the Iona community begins the journey of turning away from this idolatry. It enables members to practice this absolute trust of each other, acknowledging that each in the group is together working for justice, peace, and the flourishing of creation. This enables a critical solidarity where joining and celebrating God's work in the world is held as the aim of all of our resources, and each is held to account. And I also talk about in this article how having kind of like all of our resources together, so both money and time, also brings in a bit of a feminist agenda, and it kind of equalizes it a little bit. So it kind of, in my family group, we also account for our invisible labour. So housework, for caring duties, for things like that. And that's really important, I think, to all sit there and kind of work alongside. And it's really amazing in our group where we have some people who are my age and we have some people like living in care homes, like older people. And so kind of seeing how we value each other's times and resources, it's a really amazing exercise to do. So the second example, moving away from a kind of personal accountability that I think we should all have as Christians, and a more confidence to be able to talk about money, is to think about money as something that binds us all together, and especially in our institutions in the ecumenical movement. So David, you did use the phrase earlier, blood money, and I'd like to talk about this book by Ian White, who's the Church of Scotland minister. He's also a member of the Iona community. He's just generally brilliant. And his book, Send Back the Money, The Free Church of Scotland and American Slavery. In this research, he recounted that the Free Church of Scotland that split from the Great Disruption, with Thomas Chalmers at the helm. The issue was in patronage. They wanted, so this is the evangelical party of the church. They wanted churches to be able to pick their own ministers. So they broke away, they gave up all of their manses, they gave up their stipends. And it was portrayed as this, this big sacrifice. But this church was very mission orientated. So Thomas Chalmers started the church extension campaign, and worked to kind of get poor people into churches, to relieve poverty, that very much this idea of the Commonwealth, the church for the nation, and to support the mission and to support the ministers. The Free Church of Scotland ministers toured the Presbyterian churches in the southern US states, basically arguing that they should receive the prophets as they are the real Church of Scotland, that they're the proper Christians, was kind of the phrase. So but of course at this time the US states, these were slave-owning states, even after Britain had passed its Emancipation Bill. So Frederick Douglass even came up and toured Scotland to teach about the horrors of US slavery, on purpose to ask the Free Church of Scotland to send the money back. Frederick Douglass was the person who called this blood money. But this question about the money also brought up ecclesiological and theological questions about fellowship with a sister denomination that was committing heresy. And this was a word that they kept using. They were committing heresy, as most members of the Free Church understood the crime of slavery, as slavery by members of these churches was being justified on theological grounds. The campaign didn't in the end work, but it did create like a public outrage and a public cry, and it showed the irony of the Free Church accepting money that resulted from people being kept in bondage. So the irony of the Free Church in that people should decide accepting money from churches that were literally holding people in slavery. So this is a quote from a congregational minister in Scotland, very early on, was saying that both branches of the Presbyterian Church in the US, together with the leading denominations in that country, do fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness and become partakers in theft and robbery by admitting slaveholders to their communion and pulpits. So advocacy groups like the Emancipation Societies, they were very much saying if you have communion with slaveholders, you're partaking in that sin. So the Evangelical Church, however, with Thomas Chalmers and Hugh Miller. So Hugh Miller was the editor of the Witness, which was like their journal. they kind of wanted to be a little bit more careful. Obviously, they wanted the money. So their response to this was that we don't have slaveholders in Britain, but we did 12 years ago, and at least a portion of those were members of the Church of Scotland. But back then, no one ever proposed that they should be excommunicated simply because they held slaves. And no one ever argued that their money, which tended to the church for missionary and ecclesial purposes, should not be received. Um, so I think this is a very good kind of highlighting of when you're in communion with someone, you're sharing in communion. What does that mean when kind of a fellowship has been broken, when one person is harming another person, another part of the communion? So Ian White relates this to the anti-apartheid campaign in South Africa. In 1982, Alan Bozak at the World Alliance of Reformed Churches refused to take communion because he couldn't take communion with whites in South Africa, so why would it be fair for him to take communion with white people somewhere else in the world at this global assembly? And this led to a status confessionis where the communion excommunicated the white South African churches that promoted apartheid. And this is a similar example. The argument was we have to excommunicate churches that are keeping people in bondage, that are doing injustice. So the question at the heart of this case study in the 19th century, whether it was right for people in Scotland to worship securely, should come off of the backs of people enslaved in the United States. So bringing this to today's context of neo-capitalism, what right do we have as churches to keep investing our money in ourselves and our future when the act of investing is contributing to a neo-capitalist system of blind accumulation? Actions of divestment against fossil fuels or the occupation of Palestine, for instance, are big power moves. Having money does give us power under this capitalist order. There is a need for the church, and where possible the churches, to think about how to use their money to reflect what we believe in our worship. This is going to lead me on to my third case study. Oh no, I added some crack confession here. I just love it. So part of the confession is that we acknowledge the complicity and guilt of those who consciously or unconsciously benefit from the current neoliberal economic global system. We recognise that that includes churches, and therefore we call for confession of sin. Doesn't seem to me like many churches are confessing their sin as to their worship of mammon. So I wanted to finish with a more positive example, which was how we can use our money well. So I've literally been in the archives looking at this stuff this week, so it's a little bit raw and not completely together, but I'm really excited about it, so I wanted to share. So I've been looking at some of the work of the British Council of Churches and the Community and Race Relations Unit especially. So this was set up in 1971, but the BCC was doing work in racism ever since Windrush, as part of the division of community and an A. I don't know what the A stands for anymore. Affairs, it's at the top. So one of the things that this project did, the Community and Race Relations Unit, it was really interesting because it was never fully representative of the churches. It was always like a specialist body. So they got people in especially for their skills. So some people you might know who are in it is Paul Botang, Kenneth Slack, Ken Leach, Raj Patel. All the amazing people were involved in this. One of their projects came from the World Council of Churches Programme to Combat Slavery. Programme to Combat Racism. And the Programme to Combat Racism was one of the most controversial programmes of the World Council of Churches. They gave grants to things like the protesters in Zimbabwe, groups against apartheid in South Africa, but they also gave grants to other places around the world, including the UK. But this group, alongside of giving these grants, they also were protesting and doing lots of advocacy work. So there were so many letters to MPs, they went to visit prisons, there were campaigns talking about how Black people are treated badly in prisons. There were campaigns just about everything. It was really amazing. The public theology was absolutely fantastic. But this grant-making body was done in collaboration with Christian Aid. And what I really appreciated was that there was no sense of kind of the grants being given to show any kind of self-grandiose of the church. It was in this way kind of quite kenotic. So the assessment of the projects were, the questions they asked were, does the project combat racism? Does the project alleviate the effect of racism? Is the project responding to a need which has been articulated by the local community? Is it structurally sound? Blah, 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 blah. Are the local churches and the project willing to develop supportive links? Has the project explored other sources of support? And does the project assist in the conscientization, straight from Paulo Freire, of those involved in the wider community? So some of the projects that they helped all the way from the 70s right until the end of the 80s included setting up Sunday schools in places like Blackbird Leys, like council estates in Oxfordshire, activism for teachers who created all of these resources about anti-racism teaching in the 1970s. Cultural events for minority groups. So they sponsored tons of kind of cultural events like Rastafarian awareness days, or Caribbean collectives in music, or a soup kitchen done by Bangladeshi families. They also paid for solicitor fees for people who were being evicted. There was a big case about families being evicted from Tower Hamlets, and they paid for the solicitor, about people getting deported for no reason by the government who have lived in the UK for generations. Isn't this a familiar story? Grants for youth work all around the country. So from London, the biggest places that got grants were London, Birmingham, obviously up north in Blackburn, a few from Cardiff, not very many from Wales, Glasgow, Dundee, Edinburgh. I think this is kind of in the philosophy of MacLeod, this idea of a church who's from the leader of the Iona community, a church whose shade covers the marketplace and whose influence extends to every avenue of common life. I think that's something the church needs to aim for. And of course, the quote from Amos 5:21-52, away, let justice roll down like rivers, righteousness like a never-ending stream. I won't accept your offerings. So what I'm trying to say is, like, this is an ethical question, and I think often we think that Christians can opt out of thinking about money. We can be blind towards thinking about money. But Nathan Dever argues in his chapter in my edited book, Awake, Emerging and Connected, he looks at American evangelical Christians, but the type that don't vote Trump. And there's kind of a movement in American evangelicalism at the moment to kind of opt out of politics and to say politics isn't what Christians should be doing. We shouldn't care about politics. We should just concentrate on the spiritual things. And he argues that actually non-involvement is a decision. It's a privilege to not be involved in politics. We cannot be involved in politics because we have privilege, whereas if you are being attacked by the state for whatever reason, of course you have to be involved. If you can't feed your family, what does it mean to not be involved in politics? It's this kind of helplessness. So we have a privilege to have control over our money and our resources. People in poverty are overwhelmed with the decision of what necessity they have to decide on what to leave out. Do I feed my kids? Do I put on the heating? Or kind of what loans they have to take out to cripple them in more debt rather than where they can invest their money. We have an individual and an institutional imperative to look carefully at our economic footprint, seeing that our economic footprint is also our discipleship. What we say, what we do, what we spend, this is all connected and it can't be separated. So this idea that we can have a blind investment to look at something good, that's us turning our back on faith. The Blood Money campaign, for instance, showed us exactly that, kind of us benefiting in the world because of the downtrodden, because we're downtroddening other people is in no sense just, and it's in no sense in line with Amos or with Jesus's mission. Great. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.